Hello YouTube enthusiasts and indeed esports fans, I'm Richard Lewis. Got my little border thing, so you know it's me. And yeah, this is a video I meant to record a while ago, but I've been real busy with all my E-League commitments and stuff and just moving between digs. You can see I'm in a different place right now. So, but it's a video about Spunj, the Australian player and team captain who recently announced his retirement. I was kind of a little bit saddened to hear it, you know, but I knew it was coming. We talked about it, and I tried to talk him out of it on a few occasions, but he'd made up his mind this time. He wasn't gonna not do it, so I'm definitely sad that I might not cross paths with him again in terms of him coming to events, but if he's happy, I'm happy, right? Now, I've known Chad a long time. I'd probably met him somewhere around 2007, 2008. So this will be completely biased. If you want a video that's like an analytical breakdown of everything he achieved and an achievement list and memories from those specific events, this probably isn't the video you want to watch. In fact, this is just going to be like just a few kind of recollections about him and why I think actually the scenes kind of got him all a bit wrong, and certainly I think he deserves more respect, and him leaving is deserving of more respect than perhaps some people have actually displayed. So where to begin? I sort of first stumbled across Chad when I was working for the Championship Gaming Series. I'm sure a lot of you will have heard this bandied about, this Championship Gaming Series, or CGS, since Turner started showing Counter-Strike again. Basically, it was an attempt to televise Counter-Strike and indeed esports as a whole, which was funded by the Fox-owned News Corp. I think they put about $60 million into it, and they had a 5-year plan. And it wasn't very successful in terms of its longevity. In fact, about 2.5 years into that 5-year plan, people just got told it was over. It was shut down literally by an email that circulated. In fact, some people didn't even get that email. They had to find out when the website I worked at, a website called cadred.org, published it, because we got the email leaked to us. So it just went like that. They just had enough and it evaporated. And people discussed the merits about what it achieved and what it didn't. A lot of people who were involved in it kind of stand by how proud they are of everything it achieved. I don't know if I would be so much, and I worked for them, but equally it's not all bad either. I think without the CGS, maybe it makes it a bit more difficult to succeed in broadcasting esports in the here and now, because CGS was a great example of what worked and what didn't, and certainly in my opinion there was more mistakes made than positives. But anyway, one of the good things it did was it opened up Counter-Strike to these other regions and brought them together to play each other. So I didn't know a great deal about Australian Counter-Strike before the Championship Gaming Series. I wasn't aware how much of a scene there was. I wasn't aware of how competitive it was. Sure, I'd heard of a few teams in 1.6, but as anybody who followed 1.6 back then would know, the examples of what was achieved, I think outside of immunity maybe, it was few. It was just small potatoes, really. And there was other scenes, and indeed they'd looked to expand to Dubai even. It was going to be the Dubai Mirage. It was kind of the franchise that never was. But anyway, one of the things that it did achieve was it brought all these people from all over different parts of the globe together to play each other, and we'd never seen this kind of thing before. It was still relatively new. In fact, it was only in 2005 and 2006 where really for the first time in Counter-Strike Source, which is the game I came from, we even saw European teams playing each other. It was super rare. You know, whenever 1 or 2 European teams came to the UK event, I-Series, we were like, fucking hell, that's crazy. A European team, and invariably the European team would win. So yeah, so it wasn't, this idea of a global league was like really fucking crazy. It was like really ambitious. And Spunj was the guy who was kind of a very good representative of Sydney Underground, which was the Australian franchise. Now, Sydney Underground had two brothers on there, the Bednarski brothers, called Boomser and Tegs. Again, friends of mine. I still keep in touch with Boomser. Tegs even came over to the UK and stayed in my house many years later. I kept in touch with all of these guys, after CGS. It was like a survivors group, So what's interesting is Spunj didn't start out as a captain or a team leader. Sorry, I'm just going to have a sip of a nice delicious sody pop. He started out as kind of a player who was just considered like the middle of the pack player. This was a guy who was intelligent, but he had like decent aim. He could post decent numbers, but he wasn't like necessarily the star. A lot of people focused on Top Gun for that, and of course you had Boomser and Tegs, who were kind of the joint captains in a lot of ways. There was a lot of focus on Tegs at the time. Tegs had this little mini documentary thing about how he'd used Counter-Strike to get away from a bad period in his life, and Spunj wasn't really talked about a great deal. But what started happening was he put in these very solid performances, started getting noticed a lot more, and people realized, hey, this is a young, attractive, don't take the piss, all right? Like I said, it's okay for friends to say that about each other. I'm secure. He was a young, attractive, a very articulate guy, and he started doing more and more interviews. Now, Sydney Underground, actually, the Counter-Strike team did have some decent results, and in fact, I think it was in 2008 when they recorded a win over Berlin Alliance. And again, this won't mean a lot to anybody, but that was a team that was hotly touted as being capable of winning the whole CGS. Its lineup was made up of two Dutch players that came from the old Fnatic CSS lineup that absolutely dominated Counter-Strike. They were one of the original dynasties in Source. Two players, Xertion and Blaze. Blaze considered one of just the great rifle talents at that time. It also had Olander, who was a very big name Swedish player. If I remember correctly, I think Swedish. It might have been Finnish, but I think Swedish. Then it was Magic, or sometimes called Mike. But I think it was meant to be Magic, M-A-J-K. And then, interestingly enough, Fifflaren was on that team. And this is when Fifflaren was considered a star player also. Sweden had this great talent. And the Sydney Underground actually beat them. The Counter-Strike team actually beat them. And it was like the first time I certainly had seen a team from Australia really punch above its weight and kind of do damage to a European team, certainly in Source. It was the first time we'd ever really had the opportunity to see that. So they were on the map, and it was a huge deal, because not just them being drafted into CGS was a big deal for Australian esports, which is notoriously bereft of investment. It doesn't have a lot of sponsors, but they did it on TV. They showed that they were very articulate. They were all blue-collar guys. It was very easy to relate to. All the American TV execs were like, oh, these guys are fucking great. And for this brief moment in time, more and more people were getting interested in esports in Australia. Of course, when CGS went under, it did a lot of damage when it disappeared, when it went away, and people were left struggling. Now, this is where Spunj's story really comes into sharp focus for me, because Spunj could have just been like anyone else. There was a lot of people from the CGS who didn't know what to fucking do with themselves. And some people basically went into some little maudlin retreat to the man cave, like, oh, I'm never going to get a salary to play a game again. Fuck this. Some people quit. Some people went to back to 1.6, which a lot of them, well, not a lot of them, but some notable examples came from that game just for the money, even though they had no respect for Source as a competitive game at all. And a lot of people, like in North America particularly, where literally all the money dried up because CGS collapses, 2009, you've got the global recession. It was desolate. It was incredibly hard to get sponsorship and to make a living from esports, let alone playing esports. Like, even if you ran an organization, right, it was just like, fuck, where are the sponsorships coming from? Now, Spunj, he worked incredibly hard. I mean, so hard. During this period of time, he was one of the guys that was out there rallying Australian players to the banner, putting teams together, talking to sponsors. He was a leader in that sense. He went out and he created rosters and tried to keep the Counter-Strike dream alive. He never gave up on that. He'd had a taste of something that to him was something he really wanted in his life, and he fought to make it happen even in the most unlikely of environments. Now, as I said, there's not a lot to talk about here achievements-wise, but one of the things he did was he got talking to some friends who had some money, and effectively Vox Eminor comes out of that conversation. And you'll have heard of Vox Eminor. You know, Vox Eminor was, again, one of the few Australian organizations that were capable of putting up money and sending players abroad to compete. Before them, I think there was one called Archaic that had one event in Copenhagen. Again, Immunity obviously immediately leaps out as one of the more well-known Australian names. Vox Eminor were new, and basically Spunj put together a team and they went out, and you know what, they didn't do too bad. If you go back to 2013, they got fourth in an MSI Beat It Cup. Obviously they went to Katowice, and not a lot to talk about there, 13th to 16th, but this is a team that dominated the Oceanic region. That's key here. You're not always going to see teams come from these far-flung regions and do particularly well. You know, we don't know how well they're going to do. There's stylistic considerations. There's all sorts going on. This team dominated its region for all of this period of time, deserved its shot, top of all the qualifiers that happened in that time period. And they made it to majors, you know, 13th to 16th at Cologne. They got 9th to 12th at Katowice in 2015. And Vox Eminor was basically, I think, just again, a great proof of concept of the global capacity of supporting esports and esports organizations. Now, it didn't even end badly, but when Renegades kind of came in for them, because Renegades wanted to get into the Counter-Strike space, it all ended amicably. And again, this was an organization that had a League of Legends team, while this League of Legends is still the top dog, I would say, at this period of time, even though Counter-Strike's growing. And they chose these guys. And I know from asking around, there was a lot of reasons why they chose these guys. And primarily, it wasn't the results. People don't realize this. It was the fact that that particular roster was marketable. It had a skill ceiling it hadn't quite reached. We always felt they were underachievers. And their media work was just so good. They were just great talkers, great ambassadors for the game. And they would just go out there and do their thing. So when they got picked up by Renegades, again, they got to the final of the qualifiers in 2015. And then they get a 5th to 8th at ESWC. And then, if you remember, at Gamescom, they finished 3rd. And sure, they only played like fucking SK Gaming, I think, or maybe a few others, which they lost. I think the only team they beat was SK Gaming. But that was the nutty format, if you remember, where all the lives and the strikes and the alliances and all of this crazy stuff that Carmack had been wanting to do in Counter-Strike for ages. So all of this shows that this is a dude, right, who is literally capable of pulling a team up by his fucking bootstrings, getting them out to events, getting funding, and doing as well as they can do with the tools at their disposal. Now, for me, this sounds a lot like somebody else who the community obviously would never have a bad word said against, and rightly so. And I'm a big fan of this individual as well. So, to a lesser extent, this sounds a lot like Fallen, okay? And I know people are going to be like, wow, Richard, man, yeah, I was with you, and then you've gone too far. Think about it. Dude who is in a region that isn't particularly known for having, like, a vast abundance of talent, manages to get teams together, manages to get sponsorship in, handles it all himself, gets them to international events, and gets them on the map. Now, okay, what fucking Fallen's done with Luminosity is unreal, and even Games Academy, or now Immortals, you know, that is one of the most crazy, balmy achievements I've ever seen. That guy is a god, like, and I've always loved Fallen. I loved him since his 1.6 days. I loved him the day he came out in an interview and said Counter-Strike Source is a more tactical game than 1.6. I fucking loved him for that, because the balls to say something like that. You know, it was so sad seeing, like, all of his fans turn on him and say, oh, I always preferred Koguma or whatever. It was pretty pathetic, but always loved the guy. And, you know, look, has Vox Eminor or Renegades, were they ever successful? No. In fact, actually, you could see to a certain degree, in terms of his ability, Spunj was absolutely holding them back. He was absolutely holding them back on the server. But if that hadn't have been the case, this is one of the great, again, this is a great ambassador for the game. This is a great story. Now, where I think it all went wrong was that interview he did, where, you know, he basically was talking up the chances that they had of beating other American teams, that they deserved respect, and they had these standout like results. You know, they'd had like one-off wins. You know, that they'd beat like teams like Titan and stuff like that. And he was saying we deserve the same level of respect as a US team, and he was right at the time. But there's something wrong with this community when it comes to being outspoken. We just don't seem to like it. And I don't understand why, because one of the things I thought we always liked in Counter-Strike, maybe I'm just speaking for myself, but I always had the impression that everybody felt this way, and that is that we like trash talk. We liked our players to be honest and speak from the gut. We like people to stand up and shout back before we demanded soundproof booths and things like that. You know, we had that raw, passionate shit going on that other esports didn't. You know, you think about League of Legends and how sanitized that is, right? And you think about their interviews. Like, you think about how, like, there's an uproar because during the Battle of Atlantic, one team beat another team, and instead of ending the game, they all spammed dance and danced around the fountain. And people made threads about it on Reddit saying how disgraceful it was and how they could never support that team. Absolutely ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. And I definitely have never wanted Counter-Strike to head in that direction. That's not what we're about. That's not what our game's about, right? But what's happened here is Spunj came out and said a bunch of things, and for some reason it just turned him into a fucking pariah in the community. All of that good stuff he done, all that stuff I just talked about, right? How, you know, they were a dominant force in the Oceanic region. How he has this great pedigree going back to CGS, how he was one of the players that actually helped put Counter-Strike Source and esports back on the map in Australia for a brief period of time before CGS collapsed, how he handled sponsorship and everything else pretty much by himself. All of that just seemed to go out the window because he said, hey, I think we deserve more respect than what we get. And of course, it was like the fucking, you know, cursed by your own hubris, right? The moment after that, the next game, they get 16-0'd by Luminosity. And everyone just loved it. And it was like, that was the full stop at the end of a sentence. That was just, it was too perfect, right? Like, this guy's an asshole. And look, this proves it. It's like trial by combat, right? The Mountain comes in, Game of Thrones reference, fucking smashes your head to pieces, and everyone goes, well, yep, there you go. He must have been guilty all along because trial by combat, the gods have willed it. That's literally how it felt. It was that fucking primitive and ridiculous that everyone just started like berating Spunj. And you know, he had some moments that I think really, towards the end of his career, you could just see all this negative pressure just bearing down on him. The Chad I know, right, and like I say, we've gone out and we've had a few beers on a few occasions. The Chad I know is such a fun-loving fucking guy. Like, seriously, he's not arrogant. He's not an asshole. This guy is, like, just wears his heart on his sleeve. He's just a super nice dude and has done so much for other people. Right? Understand that when he was losing games and sorry, they were losing games, he was putting it all on himself. He was like, I lost that game. Every time he looked at the score and he saw himself down there, he used to just really wear him down. They made that decision to kick his friend Havoc, because you remember before everyone was saying kick Spunj, they were saying kick Havoc. Luke's another great guy, and they've been friends for years. They've been in teams for years, and Spunj had to make that ridiculously hard decision to cut one of his best mates from a team to progress them, and that was wearing down on him as well. That negative, you know, oh, did I make the right decision? Shouldn't it be bros forever? Who cares if we never win? He put all that behind him to make this decision to take the team forward. Now, that's unreal, and you could see it. Every time I saw him play and he didn't have a good performance, you could see it on his face. He just hated every second of that. And that's not to play the violin. You know, you're a fucking pro, suck it up. Get good, whatever you want to say. But I'll tell you, if he was the arrogant asshole that everyone said he was, he'd be living in this fucking fantasy land where he'd just be blaming everybody else, where he'd just be saying, hey, it ain't me, my team didn't do this, I didn't do that, I'm playing it smart, people think it's all about frags. You know, he'd go down these very defensive routes that we've seen other players do. He never did that. He never did that. He just believed in his team. He always believed the team could be good, and he was very disappointed in his own performances repeatedly. So, you know, it gets to Columbus, and this was the nail in the coffin as far as I could tell. It gets to Columbus, and of course that 1v1 with Freakazoid, perhaps one of the worst 1v1s, just in terms of how it was played by all sides, really. And if he wins that clutch and you know, they win that game, you know, fuck, it's a different fucking story, isn't it? Sorry, not Columbus, I should say. It's the qualifier for Columbus. My bad. I remember being there at that major qualifier, and he was crushed because he was absolutely crushed. Like, he knew in his, you know, if he wins that, they win the game and go to the major. Now, what a lot of people don't know is that obviously there was all these issues within the Renegades organization at the time, and you know, this isn't coming from him, this is just common knowledge. That team had wanted certain things that they to progress, and it just never manifested. That organization literally hung them out to dry. They were told, you know, we're going to get you this great game in house. Instead, they were actually living in a casino in Vegas, which sounds great in principle, but does have some practical problems. And they were even going to get kicked out of that, and the players had to kind of like renegotiate shit by themselves, right? Like, and again, Chad's the guy who handles that, right? So they had all of this stuff going on peripherally, and they were saying, look, we need assistance. Chad's like, I can't do it all, you know, like he felt like he had to do it all for his team. He was coming up with tactics, he's watching demos, you know, like he's doing all this work, extra additional work, and he's got to go on the server and play and call. It's too much. And you look at any modern team, any modern successful team these days, it ain't just 5 guys in a dream. They've got a support network around them. That's how it has to be these days. And Renegades never gave that. They never provided that. There was talk of a coach coming in. There was talk of this, talk of that. Didn't happen. It just didn't happen. And that was a big contributing factor to why Chad was under all of this pressure that he was putting himself under. And indeed, it just crippled him when they didn't qualify for that major. We went out and we had a few beers. That night, I'd never seen a guy look so broke up over Counter-Strike before. Like, seriously, like inconsolably broke up. Like, felt like he'd let everybody down, just really down on himself. So I knew then, and I was trying to talk him out of retire. He was going to retire. He was literally going to get on a plane and go back to Australia. I mean, that's how fucking done he was. And I was like, no, come on, man, like, it's all good, like, you can still do this, it's all, you know, there's always another day, right? But nah, he just I think that's when he made up his mind. So it seems crazy to me that this guy got so much shit. I mean, he had to close down his Twitter for a while because of all the abuse he was getting. And it's just an awful way to treat somebody who, for me, has been one of the great ambassadors of the game. Certainly not one of the greatest players of all time, not by any stretch. And perhaps towards the end of his tenure, was one of the worst pros. You know, probably. I think even he would admit that if we were talking to him. But this was a guy who got shit done. This was a guy who kept a team together. This is a guy who forged something out of nothing. And literally, like I say, at every step, wore his heart on his sleeve. They're the kind of guys that I want to see more of in Counter-Strike. They're the kind of guys I respect. And there's no way you can say that the scene is better off without people like that. There's just no fucking way. So that's kind of what I wanted to say about it. Just that, you know, look, if it ever comes up in the future, like 1 year from now, and people are like, oh, who the fuck was that Spunj guy? Maybe don't talk about something that isn't true, about how he was an arrogant asshole, and maybe don't talk about how he did that interview that one time and then got wrecked 16-0. Maybe don't talk about, you know, how he came across in interviews at all. Maybe remember, like, the positive contribution he made to Counter-Strike as a whole over the past decade, the kind of contribution that not many people get to make. And remember him for being somebody who was always honest, even if you disliked him. You know, it just seems a bit weird that we would dislike somebody like that when we exist in a world of bullshit. And keep in mind as well, I wonder if it had been different, because that team came so close to getting bought by another organization, and maybe that would have relit the fire in his belly and forced him to continue. But we'll never know. All I know is that Chad's a fucking good guy, and he achieved a lot with not a lot of resources, and played a big part in Counter-Strike history. And I, you know, for me and you, I hope, I think we should all remember that. Anyway, the good news is, because I'm talking about him like he's dead, and he's definitely not dead. The good news is, I imagine we'll see him at events in future. I think he'd make a great presence on any analysis desk. And if there's going to be more esports events in Australia, like we've seen in the past from ESL, for example, I could think of nobody better to be on the desk. And I think it'll be like a Fifth Lauren thing. How everybody was hounding Fifth Lauren into retirement and saying how shit he was. The minute he retired, everyone was like, I'm going to miss that guy. That's what happens, unfortunately. So just think about that for a bit. Thanks for taking the time out of your day to listen to this video, and I will see you on the next one. Take care.